Hello, everyone. It's Cody. Before we get into the episode today, I do want to give a quick disclaimer that this episode was recorded on Friday, June 20th. We talk quite a bit about the current conflict going on with Israel and Iran. Obviously, that was before the U.S. entered that conflict by striking the nuclear facilities in Iran, and before Iran responded on Monday, June 23rd, by striking U.S. military bases in the Middle East. So obviously it's a developing situation, but yeah, I want to make sure it was understood that this was recorded prior to any of those actions taking place. And with that, please enjoy the rest of the episode. Welcome to Propaganda Loves You, the show that asks and answers the question, if the U.S. was concerned about Iran developing a nuclear weapon, why did we leave the nuclear deal? I'm Cody, your host for this week, joined by Arthur and Joe.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Welcome back to Propaganda Loves You. We have a full docket of topics to cover today. We're going to give another update on the Israel-Iran conflict and talk a little bit about some history there as well. We talked last episode, actually I think it's 2 episodes now, about the shooting that occurred in Minnesota. And there's been a lot of talk online related to some immediate politicization of that and disinformation that spread like in the immediate aftermath of that shooting. So we'll talk about that too. And then the last topic that we'll probably hit on today is something that's been making the rounds on Substack and TikTok and related to claims that the 2024 election was stolen from Kamala Harris. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as well and to try and break down like what we actually know right now versus kind of what's being said and what's being pushed in, headlines, articles, and online. So those are kind of the big topics for today. But before we kind of get into any of those, there's just one kind of like personal update that I wanted to provide this week. That's actually kind of like one personal update that's wrapped into 2 things. But I recently deleted my Reddit account, the one that I just used to subscribe and like see news feeds and stuff like that and see what's going on without like a lot of commenting or anything. So created a new one to kind of reset the algorithm and what I was getting news wise and joined a bunch of new subs. This is just my PSA that everyone should delete their account or at least create a new one every so often. See how your news feed changes and like what the new articles or new things start popping up, because it is kind of incredible, like the things that I was just not seeing at all before. Like I was certain subreddits that I would visit more often than others, and then when you refresh that, you really get a different perspective of what people maybe just joining these subs are actually seeing. For me, the thing that was kind of impressive was just the amount of what looks like spam and bot activity and like ChatGPT drops of like these long paragraphs or like long write-ups on conflict, like very blatant biases like pushed in these things and coded as saying like it's not, this isn't propaganda, I'm not trying to be political, but then goes through the whole list of all the basic talking points that you see on any like major news network or something like that. The other thing I wanted to mention, I did join X. I joined back up on X so that I could just verify some of the things I'm seeing online. And this is actually related to the, I think we made a comment around the pictures that the DoD was sending on the official Twitter. So like when I was editing the last episode, I wanted to verify that actually came out, like make sure right before we put that up. And I did. I found like the DoD rapid response is what the Twitter handle is. And so I think there was one of these in the first term, like it was like 45 rapid response or something like that. It just was almost comical to me because I was reading the description of it, and it's basically these are like the Twitter accounts that say they're official from the government, like they have the gray check mark or whatever, and they're to fight back against fake news. And if you read through all the posts on that, it's like just all it's pushing is, well, not all it's pushing, but it seems like that's actually how to push, fake news is from those specific Twitter handles. Depending on your perspective, maybe. But anyway, that's pretty much it that I wanted to mention from my side for any personal updates this week.
So a comment and a question about your updates. The comment is that, like, just as a writing teacher, one of the first things we get into in class is about sources and how to know when to trust a source and all this. And I can't tell you how often I get this claim from students that's just like, I don't know, baked into the grade school process or something. Oh, if it's .gov, I can trust it, right? That means I can trust it if it's .gov. And ooh, that is getting more and more important to be able to have a good thing to say back against it. Short answer, no, cannot trust it if it's .gov. You should be very, very suspicious of anything .gov. But yeah, there are good government institutions still out there that do good stuff. Like, I mentioned the libraries earlier. Love the libraries. School, universities, newspapers, things like that. Yeah, the .gov stuff is getting pretty much like the propaganda in chief accounts in a lot of ways. And the question, I guess, you would mention your algorithm switch up on Reddit, and you can, I'm sure, get this similar experience on any of these apps, whether it's Twitter, or TikTok, or Instagram, or Reddit, or whatever. Did you notice any genuine information that your previous algorithm had prevented you from seeing that you're grateful that you now are able to see?
That's a good question. I think I was so kind of flabbergasted at some of the stuff I was seeing. So this is what happens, especially with Reddit, right? The more time you spend on a certain subreddit or the more often you click on like that subreddit's articles as you're screaming through your newsfeed, the more often those are going to pop up for you, right? Like it's just going to keep feeding you what you're starting to get into. And so like I don't know that I noticed that, Joe, yet, but that was also because as I was scrolling through, I was like seeing like a headline, clicking on that, reading through, being like, "Whoa," and then, like, I would see more and more of that, like, starting to pop up since it's, like, a brand new account. So I don't know yet, but we'll see over the next couple weeks, like, what I'm starting to, notice pop up and if some of that's, like, perspectives that I haven't, seen before or anything that I can trace back or whatnot. So more to follow on that, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. And the reason it's on my mind is, I don't know, I think about it sometimes that, like, not only are we getting a bunch of propaganda that is misleading or false or whatever, but as an American society, our government has a strong desire to not let us see good things about the world outside of the US that would sort of diminish the vision of the US as the society on the hill that's like, the beacon everyone aspires to. Our space program has been privatized and destroyed by people like Elon Musk and all these rockets that just explode all the time. Did you guys know that the Chinese have a space station of their own and rockets of their own that they use to send astronauts up? They're starting to do that. I don't think our government
Lies.
wants us to know about that. So that's just like an example of something like, yeah, maybe there are bad things to talk about that the Chinese government does, but our government really doesn't want us to know the good things that they do either. And like any society, there's going to be a mix of both. But I just thought it was an interesting thing that popped up for me.
Did you see the Starbase explosion? Was it yesterday? 2 days ago?
Oh, was that one of the rockets that just exploded that Elon Musk had?
Yeah, on the ground at Starbase is the name of his city,
His
I
company
think.
town in Texas, right?
Yeah, his company town in Texas where you earn credits and you can spend them at the company store.
It's not Death
And-
Star? I thought it was Death Star. Is that something else? Sorry.
That's the one that they're going to launch into space.
Oh,
And
okay.
so like it just totally explodes and destroys the pad. But kind of to touch on your Reddit point, Cody, I was logged out of Reddit yesterday. And when you're logged out, it gives you different stuff, different algorithm. Maybe it's more generalized or whatever, but I saw a lot of like anti-Iranian stuff. Like,
Mhm.
and it wasn't like posed as anti-Iranian. It was like headlines like, here's a picture of somebody who was hung at the age of 16 for some outlandish, thing like that would never happen, in U.S. So it was definitely like negative Iranian stuff the day of bombings occurring,
Yeah.
which I thought was pretty interesting.
Well, jumping into one of our main topics for today, did want to provide kind of an update on the Israel-Iran war that is occurring right now. Specifically, want to focus on a couple pieces of, I think we could say, propaganda that have come out first. So I'm going to play this clip. First is from Lindsey Graham. He went on to Fox News and is talking about the conflict.
We got a chance to end the threat to the state of Israel forever by replacing this regime with something better. And I do believe the biggest winner of the Ayatollah leaving would be the Iranian people. So pray for our troops in harm's way. There are risks associated with any operation. They join the military to keep their country safe and to make the world a better place. And taking on the Ayatollah does both. To our friends in Israel, we have your back. We're praying for success. You've tolerated too much too long. And to the world, you have normalized trying to kill the Jews. When Israel's attacked, nobody says a word about it. If France were attacked, what would the French do? What would we do? So the days of the expecting Israel to sit on the sidelines and not go to the heart of the beast are over. Take this regime down, make the world a better place.
So Lindsey Graham doing his thing, talking about how this is going to make the world a better place if we go in and topple a regime in Iran. What do you guys think? Any initial reactions to that?
My first thought was he sounded kind of tired, and it sounded like he was reading a bit, at times. For the actual context, he's like advocating for another coup, another U.S. takedown, and Israel has to enter the beast after, quote, being on the sidelines for too long. Yeah, it's just like perpetuating that war machine that it's like selling a war before it's happening. And it's definitely like positioning and a narrative positioning. And of course, it's on Fox News where Eric Trump is coming up next.
All this so-called foreign policy stuff in the Middle East, all the issues that Israel gets into and tries to drag the U.S. into successfully. We need to normalize having like a stronger historical context about all this stuff that's going on. Like, why is the Ayatollah this big bad evil in Iran? Why is a religious regime in charge of Iran in the first place? After all, in 1951, they democratically elected a popular leader under a secular government named Mossadegh. And one thing Mossadegh did was nationalize the oil industry in Iran. There was a company called British Petroleum that was sucking up the oil in Iran, and he nationalized the oil industry. And the U.S. and Western oil interests didn't like that because they couldn't, have their greedy oil straw in Iran anymore. And so the CIA orchestrated a coup that overthrew that democratically elected secular government, and then a religious regime took its place. And you can see this pattern play out again and again and again in all these different Arab countries where they do have a democratically elected leader, and I'm not saying that those leaders are all perfect or necessarily good people. They do bad things too. But they are elected under the auspices of an election, the same way that Trump was elected under I've critiqued the legitimacy of even our elections before, but I'm just saying there's at least an election process, a leader was elected, and then the U.S. government or some other Western power says, no, you actually don't get to choose your leader. We're going to choose it for you. We're going to overthrow your government. We do that all the time to protect corporate interests in these Arab countries. We don't do it to intervene on behalf of the people. Like Lindsey Graham has given this narrative that the Iranian people are going to benefit from us bombing their country and trying to overthrow the Ayatollah and stuff. The Ayatollah's been in charge for a long time now, and the U.S. hasn't done anything, right? It's that their proxy, Israel in the region, is getting threatened now and getting responded to militarily when they preemptively, which means without cause, just go and strike another country. Yeah, I get really exhausted by this narrative because I feel like it gets collapsed into a single moment. Like we only have to understand what happened on October 7th. We're not going to talk about October 6th or October 5th, 2023. Which was already on record the most deadly year for Palestinian children because of Israel's operations before the October. So it's not like it takes place in this perfectly peaceful little bubble that all of a sudden some scare quotes terrorist organization, burst that bubble. Because we also have to have a conversation about the language of terrorism in this context. The word terrorism has been used in a very one-sided way to emphasize terrible things that happen in a sort of in-your-face way, but then they don't get compared to huge bombs obliterating whole neighborhoods full of women and children and people and all, you know what I mean? I saw this old clip of George Carlin like today or yesterday or something where he was doing this bit about the Iraq War, and he was saying like during the Iraq War, American people were seeing videos of Western mercenaries getting beheaded. I don't know if you guys remember this, but I saw one of those videos when I was in middle school, and I was just like literally saw someone get their head chopped off online. And it was a crazy experience to grow up in the internet age and to have that or whatever. But he was making this point like, yeah, that's horrible. It's also horrible when you drop a bomb on a building and kill hundreds of people in a matter of seconds. And how do you explain the moral difference between the two? You call one terrorism and you call the other one a precision strike on terrorist targets. And here we are, you know what I mean? So just this language of terrorism and how it gets used in a very one-sided way, I guess. But yeah, Lindsey Graham has always been just like the cheerleader for Israel. And we could dig into the money and see a very logical reason for why he is so gung-ho for Israel.
And so if that upsets you, the reason I wanted to show this one was because I think we predicted this on our last episode, I think is what I wanted to say. So just going to play this.
Tell me which Arab country has stepped up and said, you know what, we're going on the side of Iran. They're doing so great. The Israelis are kicking their asses left and right. The U.S. hasn't even gotten involved directly. So where are they? They're nowhere. How about China? Nowhere. How about Russia? Nowhere. What happened to World War III? There is no World War III. They all sound like a bunch of Marxist Islamists. They don't sound like patriotic Americans. Let me be clear. This is good versus evil. You're either a patriotic American who's going to get behind the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, or you're not. One other thing. These little weasels in Congress like Tom Massey, the War Powers Act. And I'm a constitutionalist, he says, and I know the president's not, he can't do this on his own. Hey, Tommy, let me educate you about the Constitution. Is the War Powers Act in the Constitution? It was passed in 1973. Was the Constitution adopted in 1973, Tommy? I don't think so. So you're joining up with Tlaib, who supports the enemy. Omar, who supports the enemy. Folks, this is black and white. You're either on the side of the red, white, and blue, or you're on the other side. It's that simple.
So that's Mark Levin on, what is it, Life, Liberty, and Levin? That's his show on Fox News. I'm not really familiar with that show, to be honest with you, but I think we said last week that it's going to be, if you're not supporting this, then the rhetoric is essentially going to be, then you're anti-American, right? And immediately, that's what comes out. They're trying to present it as this black and white, like you support the president, you support this action, this military action, and that's patriotic. That's what, a real American would do versus anything else is equivalent to supporting the enemy. And I'm just like, I don't know. I want to talk about this more later after we kind of talk through some of the history. But in my mind, a lot of this situation when it comes to the governments that are acting here, like Iran, super oppressive government. They're not like, free liberty for their people or anything like that. Hamas, also oppressive to the people in Gaza. Hezbollah in Lebanon has also done, attacks against civilian targets. This is kind of, in my mind, like an everyone sucks here, sort of situation. If you've ever seen like the Reddit threads where it's like, am I the asshole? And it's like they're a couple different categories, like, yes, you're the asshole, not the asshole, or everyone sucks here. Like, everyone has done terrible things, like from these different governments at different times. And so like just presenting this as a black and white, you're either in support and you're a patriot, or you're in support of the enemy. It's just presenting something that has a lot of nuances, very black and white, and like one way or the other way, I guess is my point in this. And the fact that, we talked about this last week, that this was going to be an argument that was going to pop up pretty much immediately if you had anything to say other than support for this conflict. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a difficult kind of subtlety in the conversation to draw because, this is why historical context is so important, because like I agree with you on the one hand that you don't want to be in the position of supporting any sort of oppressive regime, whether it's, pro-Western or pro-Arab or whatever you want to call it. But the historical context is important because it puts the reasons for different actions into a bigger story that makes more sense. Like if I read C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, and learn about the Haitian slave revolution, and you read all of these terrible things that the revolting slaves did to the white slave owners and their families when they overtook the plantations. They pillaged and raped and murdered their slave owners. And as students of history, it's not like whether the history is in the past or taking place in the present moment, it's not like you are put in a position where you have to cheerlead terrible, violent things that occur. But at the same time, you understand that they take place in a context that makes sense. When you enslave a population in that way and treat them like cattle, you should expect a certain kind of reaction at a certain point. And many analysts have talked about the Hamas surprise attack on October 7th, have tried to describe it more in terms of a prison outbreak, because Gaza has been called by a lot of people internationally as the world's largest open-air prison. Israel likes to say, we withdrew in 2005 or 2007, whenever it was, when Hamas leadership was elected, and they've been on their own since then. You're controlling the whole perimeter. You've got a wall around the whole place. You control ingress and egress, food supplies, all that stuff. And so you have a captive colonized population, and under international law, they have a legal right to armed resistance. And so you have to understand the retaliation from colonized groups in that context, right? I'm not saying, yay, do all the violence you can in order to free yourselves, but I am sitting here as a person observing the moment thinking, that makes a certain kind of sense. I don't want to personally be in a position where I'm doing that violence. I consider myself a pacifist in that way. But when I'm sitting back and watching what's happening, you can sort of study the actions of the colonizers versus the actions of the people they're colonizing and understand those different perspectives in a way that makes a little bit more sense. So you're not saying, yay, one side, but you are saying it makes sense that an oppressed group is going to fight back at a certain point. You know what I mean? And so I guess that's all I'm trying to say, is that it's not like I don't want to support one side, therefore they're both equally bad or equally good. It's a subtler thing of saying it's all bad, yes, but the retaliation, like cause and effect, on a bigger historical scale, just understanding basic cause and effect is the main thing I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this goes directly into kind of what I wanted to talk about today, because I think some people might look at these all in disconnected instances, right? Like what's going on in Gaza with Hamas doing the attack on October 7th in Israel, what happened in Lebanon with Hezbollah and Israel attacking all of Hezbollah and taking out basically their entire leadership with the pager attack, or with the attacking the Houthis. Like it all comes back to the conflict too with Iran, because those groups are all part of Iran kind of foreign policy of how they fight back through the proxy wars, right? I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm saying that it's all connected to that larger conflict that we're now seeing between Israel and Iran, right? They fund those groups, Hamas, they fund Hezbollah, and they fund the Houthis. That's part of their resistance, right? That's how they operate and how they impose costs on countries that they know they couldn't actually fight directly generally, right? It's almost the same concept of what we talked about with Russia investing so much in their cyber and information warfare capabilities because they know they can't compete militarily. So it's an alternative form of warfare that they invest in. It's kind of the same thing here, where Iran invests into these proxy organizations to attack the countries that they have issues with. But I think the point, though, and to your point, Joe, right, there's a ton of history there on why that might be occurring, why Iran would want to attack these countries and why they would fund these groups, right? And so for me, it always comes back to the 2015 nuclear deal, because that was kind of the reset, or it could have been the reset of relations with Iran at that point. They had agreed to not develop weapons grade uranium. A lot of those tensions were coming down. And then after the U.S. pulled out of that in 2018, that's when a lot of this ramped back up, because, okay, we left this deal that we had made with them, went back on that. There was a chance for this kind of relationship to be reset that was put in place diplomatically and then torn away. And now it's the conversation is just, oh no, they're going to have a nuke, that we must do this. Well, and I've got a couple other clips to talk about, the nuke thing and Netanyahu. But yeah, any thoughts on that before we get into that?
Yeah, I remember growing up with George W. He had Iran in the axis of evil. And then Obama put forth that nuclear deal. And it was about there were some really good sanctions there. It was about them not having any weapons grade and not building weapons. And then Trump pulled out in 2018 saying it's a bad deal. And then I remember in 2020, remember like Trump ordered some high-ranking general. It was like Soleimani or
Soleimani.
something. Yeah, I just remember reading about he was like at an airport or something, and then the consequences of that. So it is like kind of if you follow the dominoes of cause and effect, like what Joe's saying. I'm looking at the domino of Trump and pulling out because of like people like Netanyahu pressuring him, and Netanyahu, going around on his like lecture circuit saying that Iran has a nuclear weapon next week, and it just never being true. Oh, nice. So yeah, here we go.
So there's two things I want to talk about here, right? Netanyahu and like the justification for this strike, the justification that they've come out with and saying is that they can't let Iran have a nuclear weapon, like that is an existential threat to Israel, and that they would want to destroy the country of Israel. And I like, okay, like if that was 100% true, and like that was like, yes, they came out and said it, and they're 2 weeks away from a nuke, and that was like all verifiable. Okay, then maybe there's an argument there. But let's watch this clip on Netanyahu talking about Iran and their nuclear weapons program. This is from The Daily Show. They put this together, I think, like this week.
In a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months.
They have the wherewithal, the stored up, preserved knowledge to make a bomb very quickly if they wanted to do it.
Iran is so dangerous. Weeks away from having the fissile material for an entire arsenal of nuclear bombs.
They're very close. They're 6 months away from being about 90% of having the enriched uranium for an atom bomb.
Iran is gearing up to produce 25 bombs, atomic bombs a year, 250 bombs in a decade.
Ladies and gentlemen, time is running out.
Iran will be capable of producing alone, without importing anything, nuclear bombs within 3 to 5 years.
We'll put the link to that clip in the show notes, but that was from The Daily Show, and it basically is tracking Netanyahu from 25 going backwards to 1995, and all of those statements saying that they're within a week, within 2 weeks, within a month of creating nuclear weapons. So that line has been there for 30 plus years, coming from Netanyahu. And the other thing that came out was the U.S. intelligence agencies basically don't agree with Trump's assessment that they are about to build a nuclear bomb. I'm biased in that I believe the intel agencies in this scenario, but Trump doesn't.
Yeah. Do you guys know the UN Security Council, how it was formed after World War II? What do you need to be a member of the UN Security Council?
How do you need
Maybe
a
I'm
nuke?
wrong about that. Yeah.
So
Like it
is
was
that like
basically
the-
after World War II, all right, we live in an international community. Nobody's in charge of anybody, but let's be honest, the people with the nukes have the most power. And the U.S. had just proved that with, just eviscerating civilian populations in Japan twice when they didn't need to. And so the UN Security Council is all of these countries who already had nukes. And part of the idea is that no other country is allowed to get a nuke, right? These are the only ones that have them now. Let's stop there. Nobody else gets nukes. We're going to stop nuclear proliferation, stop the spread of nukes, all this stuff. Why does Israel have a nuke? Okay. You see, so one country was allowed to successfully develop a nuclear armed program in that time. I'm trying not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but sometimes conspiracies happen. There's one U.S. president who tried to inspect Israel's nuclear program to stop them from developing nukes, and that was John F. Kennedy. You can look at letters between him and the president of Israel, Ben Gurion, at the time, and Kennedy was really aggressively trying to investigate Israel's nuclear program, and that effort stopped after he was assassinated, and then they developed their nukes successfully, and AIPAC influences all of our elections. And here we are now. We're in a situation where the discourse has just totally normalized the fact that a country outside of the Security Council was able to successfully develop a armed nuclear program with no consequences. But we're talking about a hypothetical program that Iran may or may not have. And this same country who's guilty of doing that wants us to go to war with this other country. You know what I mean? It's enough to make your head spin in circles. And again, historical context is so important with these things.
My head kind of got lost in just thinking about the UN Security Council and what a joke it is, and how they just sorry, it's going to be off topic, but just how they do the whole veto power. They all get this veto power, and they all just veto there's an investigation into Syria for 1,000. It's just like the offender actor just like vetoes it immediately. They're like, no, Russia vetoes Ukrainian investigation. And yeah, it's just a joke. It's a really interesting point, though, that you bring up, Joe, and how Israel is just allowed to do that, and how the U.S., I guess, has like tried to even verify the data that Iran has this capability, and they've not found that to be the case. And yet Israel, under the U.S., is like allowed to build out that arsenal.
That came from Tulsi Gabbard. That was this current administration when his own director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, came out and said that Iran wasn't close to actually building a nuclear weapon, or even hadn't made the decision, I think, to go in that direction, right? Like they were still weighing that. Because I think Iran, the leadership, probably, this is speculation on my part, but like they probably know, they have to know what position they're in, right? They can't win like an all-out conflict here. So if they actually went in that direction, they might be able to impose significant damage on all of these countries, but it would also result in regime change in their, basically the annihilation of the current regime. So they know that, right? So weighing that between, should we develop this nuclear weapon that everyone is watching us and thinking about us developing this nuclear weapon, or should we like keep doing these proxy wars, hoping that we'll impose enough cost to be able to get back to the negotiation table, back to a actual deal, right? It's like weighing those two things. And just like a personal anecdote here, the other thing it made me think about was I had a relative during Trump's first term ask me what the military thought about Trump. And I started thinking, like, I think back to the answer I gave because I didn't give a good answer. I said, like, oh, it's an embarrassment. And what I should have said was, you know, as someone that works in the intel community, that's how like a lot of us felt, or at least I certainly felt that way, and some of the people I work with, because Trump continuously just ignores all of that. Like he thinks he's the smartest person in the room and like completely ignores advice from intel professionals or whatnot and just dismisses it out of hand. And this is just another example of that, right? Like it doesn't fit what he's trying to do. It doesn't fit what he wants. So I just disagree completely with all of these people that, you know, are experts in their field.
He's good at firing the experts. He'll probably fire, he'll fire whoever says that they don't have like nukes. Pete Hegseth is now in charge of Intel, and he has a feeling.
It's the what is it? The yellow cake or the WMD thing all over again, right? Yeah, pretty much.
And start seeing weird pictures of like aluminum tubes and stuff. And then you're going to see American generals holding up little bars of gold after they've raided the treasuries in Tehran. Like, let's not do this again. Let's not do this. You know, like over 1 million Iraqis had to die for that nonsense, and they're going to try to do the same thing or worse in Iran. Let's not do that.
I don't think it's ever worked. I mean, like for all the times we've overthrown different countries, has it ever resulted in a better situation? I mean, you look at Iraq, we overthrew that in, what was it, the 2000, when did we start going into there originally? 2004, 2005, something like that with Bush 2.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was what, the 1990s thing, right?
Kuwait, yeah.
Yeah, you said, did it work? I was going to just throw a rhetorical question in, like, what do you think the point of it was? What were they trying to accomplish? Not what they said they wanted to accomplish, you know, spread democracy. Okay, yeah. What did they want to accomplish?
Has the overthrow of a government from the United States ever resulted in a more peaceful and democratic, or at least more human rights in a place? So it's like, what has it ever resulted in something better, I guess is my question.
It's resulted in more profit. I mean, like to Joe's original, like, you know, talking about the 53 coup of Iran and like, you know, when they nationalize oil, which, can you imagine something more offensive to capitalism than to nationalize oil? That's
BP now, by the way. British Petroleum is BP. It's the same thing.
Which we talked about, I think, on another thing, because they kind of came up with the original propaganda of like the carbon footprint instead of like putting it onto corporations and stuff. So I think BP would be like, oh yeah, that was definitely a good move.
Wait, can you say more about that? Are you talking like pay like back onto you, the consumer, like you need to drive less or you
Yeah,
need to
BP.
do.
Yeah, they had like in the I forget we talked about it in some episode, but I think it was the '90s. They put out commercials and they came out with the original PR campaign to talk about carbon footprint, about like the individual having a carbon footprint and putting it on yourself. And it's like don't have the water on while you brush your teeth, kind of stuff, rather than like Elon's got 9 pools filled with fresh water every Tuesday, whatever.
Yeah. I didn't realize that was them. I guess I assumed that it had to be some corporation, but I didn't realize it was
Yeah.
BP that was pushing that.
They also do like I don't know. I was watching TV like maybe like 6 months ago, and I saw a BP ad, and it was just like some generic fluff, like sunshine, rainbows. We clean the most oil, like out of these contaminants. It's like you're doing it.
I don't know. I was just going to tie it back to what you were saying about the destabilization and everything. And earlier in the 20th century, it was true in Southeast Asia and the Philippines. I think the industry was like tin and rubber or something like that. But I've mentioned before, just tracking the raw materials any imperial power needs to produce their commodities. Like now we're doing technology and we need all these precious minerals and stuff. You have to just follow the industry, what it needs. The reason that U.S. and Western powers want Africa and Arab states destabilized and chaotic is because it's cheaper for them to, through second or third parties, get these raw minerals that they need for free, or, the child labor, slave labor in the Congo. We could do a whole deep dive on the Congo or Sudan and just how it benefits these corporations to have that access in order to produce these toys for us and the technological society we're in. But yeah, that's the goal of all of these regime changes, is to create conditions that are easier for capitalists to exploit. That's it.
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors. Iran is coming, or already here, or maybe just somewhere. The point is, you're not safe.
That's why Liberty Stronghold is proud to release Middle East Ready Kit, our first bunker bundle tailor-made for the forever war.
With a 30-year shelf life, halal-certified tactical jerky, and a portable Iron Dome simulator that makes the neighbors think you're Israeli Defense Forces.
Every kit includes a laminated Axis of Resistance Identification Guide and a scratch and sniff Hezbollah chart to heighten situational awareness.
And our exclusive Netanyahu soundboard plays 1990s nuclear warnings on a loop to keep morale and cortisol levels high.
Remember, if the war doesn't reach you, it's your duty to meet it halfway.
Liberty Stronghold is not responsible for misidentification, false flag hobbies, or backyard drone mishaps. Emotional fallout not covered by bunker warranty.
So to close out, like, at least the Netanyahu portion of this, we watched a video earlier that was Fox News, like, trying to drum up support for the war for Americans. Netanyahu also did a interview on ABC that I want to play just a bit of here. So I want to play this clip because it's an instance of, someone coming onto like a U.S. news program, foreign leader, to try and drum up support for the U.S. to enter their war.
What we need to do, I'm not going to get into the details, but we've targeted their top nuclear scientists. It's basically Hitler's nuclear team. We got them. We still have work to do on other sites. We have targeted their ballistic missile manufacturing facilities. Understand this. You see these bombs. You saw a single bomb. It's a 1-ton bomb, John, dropping on Tel Aviv and other places, causing killing men, women, and children. They're deliberately targeting our population. We're not doing that. We're targeting their military sites, their nuclear sites, their ballistic missile sites, so they don't have 20,000 of them that no country could survive with. Yeah, they want to continue stringing us along, but there's a limit, because if we don't act now, there won't be a 13th hour. So we have to act. But what I'm saying is that we're not merely protecting ourselves. We're protecting everybody. We're protecting our Arab neighbors with whom we want to expand the peace, as we did under President Trump's leadership in the Abraham Accords. That will be possible if Iran is defanged. We're also protecting the world. They have ballistic missiles that can now reach deep into Europe and soon could reach the United States. And imagine what this regime that caused death to America every time, that bombed your American embassies, that murdered 241 Marines in Beirut, that killed and injured thousands of American servicemen in Iraq and Afghanistan, that tried to blow up a restaurant in Washington, that burns the American flag. You want these people to have nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them to your cities? Today it's Tel Aviv, tomorrow it's New York. I understand America first. I don't understand America dead. That's what these people want. They chant death to America. So we're doing something that is in the service of mankind, of humanity, and it's a battle of good against evil. America should and does stand with the good. That's what President Trump is doing, and I deeply appreciate his support.
Where do we donate? Venmo at Netanyahu? Is that recent? Is that him like this week or something?
I don't know exactly. I should look up the date for that. But yeah, that was recent. That was him and trying to drum up support basically to bring the U.S. into the conflict. And the reason they need the U.S. in the conflict is because we have, well, I don't even think it's like proven, it's theorized, right? That we have the only aircraft and munitions capable of destroying like their major nuclear like facility that's deep underground, that we're basically the only ones that have a chance of destroying it. So like, if they don't destroy that, then all of this that they're doing is basically just setting a nuclear program back a little bit. But like we even talked about before, back from what? Like they weren't planning to create a nuke. So, but they might, if like they feel like this is how it's going to go. I don't know. Like it's self-fulfilling prophecy almost at this point. But
yeah.
The thing I wanted to talk about here is like, so that's a foreign leader coming into the U.S. and trying to drum up support for a war. And we've had others do that. We had, Zelensky come on, and I don't know if he went on the news and tried to do that to the American public, but he spoke to Congress, and that was put onto the news. I just wanted to get your thoughts, like, between those two. Do you see a difference there between Zelensky coming in and trying to drum up support for Ukraine versus, Netanyahu coming in and trying to drum up support for us to enter a war in Israel? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the main obvious difference between those two is one is trying to use his military and whatever support he can gather to expel a force that invaded their country, and the other one is a bloodthirsty, colonizing terrorist state that murders women and children every day. And so the hypocrisy of it is obvious. As the Daily Show clip you played implied, like Netanyahu's biggest dream for decades now has been a war with Iran with the U.S. behind him. Like that's what he's always wanted. And Trump is, as most businessmen of that type are, you need to flatter them in order to get what you want. And so I think Netanyahu is just going to shrewdly flatter Trump in whatever way he needs to get the U.S. behind him. And it just sucks to have a person in charge of the country who is that easily manipulated.
Definitely. He's like promised the Gaza Strip. It's like Trump literally put out an AI video about like Trump's future. They're giving him like a building and he's selling out nations and millions of people.
Yeah. Look at the statue. Yeah, let's do that. Great plan.
Yeah, he's distracted by shiny things. Netanyahu said, what did he say? He said, they target our population. These are men, women, and children. We don't do that. We do precision strikes. I thought that was just like a bit ludicrous. And it reminded me of an article I saw maybe yesterday when a bomb did strike a hospital in Israel, and the general at the time did some interview on TV and said something akin to like, these are monsters and villains who would ever strike a hospital. They're elderly people here. Meanwhile, of course, they've destroyed plenty of them.
Yeah, I don't even know. I mean, at that point, it's like hypocrisy there's not a strong enough word. I feel like, we need to come up with it. Did the Germans have a better word for hypocrisy? They usually have like 12 words for something, and one of them is like way more descriptive. So We'll have to figure that out.
Hey, it could be a good segment. We call it Hypocrisy now.
The last thing I wanted to kind of touch on related to the Iran and Israel conflict, and we talked about this a little bit before, but this is like when I was talking about Iran and how they kind of operate and how they support these different groups, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, and Hamas. And so you'll hear them labeled as terrorist organizations constantly. And Joe, you touched on this, but there's like a concerted effort to make people think that the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas are like equivalent to like Al Qaeda or ISIS. So I want to just lay out a couple things that are very different between these groups. One of the main things there is what their focus is, right? Like these groups are regionally focused. They're focused on like their country or their neighboring countries, the areas in the Middle East. They're not focused globally. When you think about like ISIS or Al Qaeda, they're doing attacks in Western countries, right? So it's a different goal, different outcome. Like Al Qaeda, obviously, when they attacked the World Trade Center, but then you have ISIS doing the attacks in France and inspiring other attacks across Europe, right? So the global versus regional is definitely a major thing there. And then also the ideological underpinnings of these two groups, right? These groups that Iran is funding and supporting, again, are working to try and retain control in their local area of their country or push the U.S. or other Western interests out of their country. Which, Joe, to your point, like, okay, that kind of makes sense why you wouldn't want somebody else in your country that you don't agree with being there and is exploiting your resources, right? Like that is a logical step that you can make versus like, again, going back to ISIS, if you were in their controlled territory and you didn't agree with them, you were either a slave or you were killed or sold. So that's kind of the thing there in my mind that's different between these two groups. Like one is complete domination of anyone that's in their area versus trying to retain control and power. I'm not making a moral I am making a moral thing. I think like the extremist religion one that just murders everybody or takes slaves because they think that they're less valuable than them because they're not a true believer. Yeah, I think that that's probably a more evil organization writ large than one that is trying to retain power in their country, and they may use oppressive tactics, but if they're not murdering wholesale all the people or enslaving their entire population, I think you can see a difference there between these two groups. They're not the same thing in my mind, but I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts on that as well.
I mean, I guess the only thing to say really is to reiterate what I'd said earlier. Like I try to understand, and I should say also, I don't study these groups individually. Like I haven't read all the literature on Hamas or Hezbollah or all this stuff. I just know a handful of things I've picked up. But specifically with Hamas, because it's just such an easier example to understand, occupied populations have an inner right to armed resistance. Yeah, and so like I've heard claims that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I have seen very little proof of it. And people would point to October 7th as an example of that proof. I don't really want to get into the details of all of that, but the first thing I would want to refer to is Israel's Hannibal Directive. If you've never looked up the Hannibal Directive, that accounts for a lot of what happened on October 7th, and all of that conveniently in Western media gets attributed to Hamas, when in fact the Israeli army's retaliation on that day was responsible for a lot of the damage that took place. And, the numbers for that day, they said 1,400 civilians were killed, and they brought it down to 1,200, then it's like 1,100 and something. And when you actually get into the details of it, some 700 something of the people who died were actually Israeli soldiers, not civilians. And so anyway, the point being, not to get into relitigating all that, but just to say that the narratives in Western media would have us believe that any violent reaction from these occupied groups is terrorism. They don't want to have a conversation about the legitimacy of the violence of the oppressed groups when they react. But international law gives oppressed groups the right to armed resistance. And so when you're talking about these groups in a very local context, especially surrounding Israel, like we talk about Hamas with Israel, but Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, you could talk about the Golan Heights as occupied, contested territory. And so you could have a conversation about Hezbollah in southern Lebanon even as a in a colonial perspective, a partially occupied or colonized group that's trying to have that struggle for their ancestral homeland. Yeah, very different context.
No, I mean, that totally makes sense. Hezbollah gained power, by resisting an Israeli occupation backed by U.S. weapons. And I know the Houthis had some, like the U.S. shaped, it was enabled by like a Saudi war that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. So it's like some of these groups, like, I mean, even with Iran, it's like Reagan sold weapons to them. The U.S. is backing and supporting a lot of these groups. And it's a lot of hypocrisy that's fueling these, moments.
Yeah. I was going to offer a more helpful comment, perhaps, to talk about the issue you originally raised between a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda and then groups like Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis that are more regionally focused. And it comes right back to the centerpiece of propaganda and what we talk about all the time is what are the intentions behind the actions? Do these people legitimately have the liberation of their people on their mind in some way when they're acting, or do they have conquest and control of resources on their mind when they're acting? That would be maybe a more helpful distinction to draw.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because then I think if you look at it through that lens, just using ISIS as an example, right? They captured land, they enslaved populations of that land or drove them off the land and tried to create a new country, essentially, with the caliphate that they created between the land that they took in Iraq and Syria. So, yeah, if we made a checklist, right, of like, what are the actions being taken? What's the thing there? Maybe that would be a helpful thing for people to understand. Because then in the context of like the Beirut bombing from Hezbollah, but that Netanyahu was talking about, like that's a real thing that happened, right? There were multiple bombings that Hezbollah did against the U.S. embassies and whatnot in Lebanon. But then you think about like in their mind, if they're trying to drive someone that they look at as a foreign invader out of their country, then it definitely changes the context, or at least how you think about like the actions that were taken.
Yeah, I mean, think about that Patrick Swayze movie, Red Dawn, as like a piece of propaganda. If a foreign force invaded our country, ironically, because, we're, as white people, we're already a foreign force invading the indigenous land of North America. But anyway, if a foreign force were to invade our country and take over and install bases all over the place, do you think people in America are not going to attack those places? Like, what do you realistically expect to happen? It's a basic cause and effect kind of thing you can follow when you start to study the history.
Yeah, and I think maybe the other thing that we should look at too, and like I would need to research this more. Like I'm sure people have already done this, and there's probably books on this. But in the context of Lebanon at that time, what was the ruling government, and like what was Hezbollah's relationship to the ruling government that was in Lebanon, right? And how did that government get put in place? Like, was that backed by us, or was that, a democratically elected government, right? All those things probably matter in the context of an attack taking place against U.S. personnel in another country. Like, why are we there? Like, did we get invited? Was it by a democratically elected populace? Like, all of those questions probably need to be answered at some point to really get the full, I guess, view on that. Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors.
Feeling overwhelmed by the Middle East? Too many factions, dates, and uncomfortable facts? Don't worry. Truth AI is here to simplify your worldview.
Our new Axis alignment mode scans your newsfeed, scrubs inconvenient history, and replaces it with clean, simple binary. Good versus evil. Allies versus terrorists. Us versus them.
Want to understand the axis of resistance? Truth AI will auto-rewrite it as Axis of Nuclear Psycho Terror Demons, pre-labeled for bipartisan outrage.
We've partnered directly with the Netanyahu Neural Archive to generate real-time threat alerts going back to 1996. Why wait for actual uranium when you can feel irradiated today?
Plus, with instant recollection syncing, your memory of failed predictions, botched intelligence, and CIA-backed coups will be softly erased. Don't recall it? It didn't happen.
Reality is a product. Let Truth AI curate yours.
Truth AI is a narrative optimization tool. Do not use near contradictory evidence, functioning journalism, or regional nuance. Side effects may include sanctioned airstrikes, ideological blindness, and simulated mushroom clouds. Operated in partnership with Heritage Vault and ClearSight Technologies TM.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about what occurred in Minnesota, the shooting that took place there. the murder of the Democratic Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman, and her husband. And there was, immediately after that occurred, pretty much a lot of people in the, I guess, MAGA sphere, or that information space, started promoting theories that this person was like a Marxist and was involved with the No Kings protests, and said that they were a Democrat or aligned to Democrats because they had been put on some committee that the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, had appointed them to, like back in like 2019 or something like that. And so like, there's always like fringe people that are always going to be doing crazy shit like right away, right? But then Senator Mike Lee came out and like tweeted the same thing before any of the details were actually brought in from law enforcement, and before he was captured or anything like that. And so it's not so much that I want to talk about the specific information that they're putting out or the claims that they're making, but kind of the conversation I want to have is one, most of the media, when they're covering these things that people are saying about this, they're saying like, oh, Mike Lee promotes misinformation. I think by using the term like misinformation, we're downplaying what's going on. And the reason I say that is because, like, back to our second episode where we talked about what's propaganda, we talked about like what's disinformation versus misinformation. We said misinformation is like, oh, I didn't know that it was wrong, and I just put this out, like, this information. And in this case, that's not what's occurring in my mind. This is disinformation. It's deliberately intended to push someone in a certain direction. So one, I wanted to talk about that, get your thoughts on like, are we using the right words? Like, are we describing these things correctly? Are we actually saying what these people are doing? And then two, how do you fight back when the immediate reaction is to politicize and just claim right off the bat without doing the exact same thing on your end? Because I mean, if the opposite would be us saying like, without any facts, without anything coming in, oh, this is a radical Trumper that has gone into this. Turns out that's actually the truth, but we had to wait a little bit before it actually came out. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about that and get your guys' thoughts on that whole situation there.
Yeah, it's like preemptive. It's like narrative, like preloading, where they like right off the bat, they just attack it, they politicize it. It's kind of like exactly what they did with George Floyd. And now that the platforms are owned by the people pushing the conspiracy theories, it's like the algorithm rewards it, and it's just surfaced to the very top. So it's pretty horrible. Like, there's no slow journalism that can win through. It is all like headlines, and it's loading the narrative before the story gets told. And to your point, it turns out to be the antithesis of this. So yeah, it's like, how does slow journalism win out?
Totally. And it's like, I don't know, in this moment that we're living through, we're assuming we all don't get nuked into obliteration. We will have a moment of time in the future where we're looking back and trying to understand all this. And part of the thing that's useful to do now, and we're kind of doing it on this podcast, is to document the propaganda that's happening as it comes. And so you were trying to think, what do you call this? The right-wing disinformation spheres? And I'm just thinking like fascist propaganda. I don't know, just fascist propaganda in this time. Like it's coming from random people, but it's also coming from the Department of Defense. It's coming from the Department of Homeland Security. You guys see that totally Nazi poster they sent out with if you see a person that doesn't look white, basically, call this number. That the Minnesota State Police, right? Like right after it, just tweeted a picture with all these pieces of paper that said no kings. And that was part of the thing, like, oh, don't go to the protest today just to stay safe. And that in and of itself creates like a nugget that the discourse latches onto and runs with. And so even the local police force, the way that they're communicating about it can be misleading in one way or another. I don't know anything about their intention, but the result that had was that people automatically assumed this was some sort of person affiliated with an anti-Trump movement, which that's the fascist propaganda right there. And maybe we could talk about the checklist for propaganda and just sort of workshop a list of things we think count as like, yep, propaganda, you should be very suspicious of it. I have three things, really. A message that wants to spread, and it has a strong ideological preference, and it is deceiving the audience in some way. It wants to spread, it has a strong ideology, and it wants to deceive you in some way. Those are my three things that I tend to think of with propaganda.
Yeah, I was just thinking that on that side, like limited or questionable sources, or like no or questionable sources. It could be another part of that too. Like,
That's where you gotta be careful because the sources legitimize the claims, like it helped George W. Bush drum up support for the Iraq war when he was able to point to the intel community as a source for the claims he was making about nuclear weapons. And so we even have to be careful with how the sources are used.
yeah, what are the sources? What are their what could their motivations be, right, for putting out that information? Which I think goes back to the whole problem in the first place, and we talked about this a little bit before. Like, that takes effort and time to like do that work to draw back and like figure out where this is originally coming from, or where the ideological underpinning actually is on that. I don't know. I keep coming back to this concept of in my head. I haven't figured out how to relay this in a way that makes sense yet, but I keep coming back to the concept of like trying to anchor on your like certain values. And maybe this is like the Marine Corps thing, like core values or whatnot. But if you do have a way to like understand what's important to you, then it's less about interpreting messages. It's more about like looking at the big picture. What are groups doing? Like on a larger scale, like each individual piece of news or each individual spin, yeah, that might be difficult to understand exactly what's going on. But if you look at that group on a larger scale, what's that organization doing? What are the actions they've taken? What have they done in the past? Have they lied before? Right? Like have they like maybe that's like a thing that you should think about. But does that make sense? Like what I'm trying to explain?
Yeah, and it's hard because this is part of the problem of living in the super modernized world where we're at a point in culture where we've been given permission to critique everything. And then we get to this trap of nihilism where it feels like nothing matters at a certain point because all of the power structures have been critiqued and delegitimized. You can't trust any authority figure, these sorts of things. And it does come back to this question of how you want to orient your perspective in the world, what sorts of values you want to look at. And personally, this is why I end up studying a lot of Buddhism and practicing meditation and stuff, is because it gives me that kind of anchoring point of view that I feel like I can trust to lead me in a helpful direction, right? And so, first of all, it's important to understand that you're always looking through the lens of some conceptual framework. Like, even when you try to totally wipe away all of your concepts and just look at the bare reality of what you're dealing with, there's some, even if it's subtle and unnoticed, some conceptual framework that's organizing your experience in your mind. And so to just start paying attention to that more and more, what are my conceptual frameworks I bring to the way I look at the world? And then I try to like practice compassion. First of all, like understanding where is there suffering in the world? Where are people, human beings or animals suffering? What's the cause of that suffering? And is there anything I as an individual or us as a society can do to help alleviate that suffering? And that in a very basic way helps me orient myself, or at least remind myself when I'm wasting my time on one thing that I have no control over and I can't do anything about, and maybe I should redirect my energy somewhere else. That kind of basic compassionate outlook helps me feel a little bit more sure-footed about the way I'm looking at the world.
Probably keeps you a little bit more sane if you're thinking about like what is it I can actually what's in my sphere of control versus
I was just gonna say that guy, I don't know, it's tough. Like you want to say the guy's name, for accuracy, but also like you don't want to give rise to like, all these mass shooters, whatever. Vance Boitler or something. I don't. Yeah, but it was like deemed that he was Republican. He's been a registered Republican in Oklahoma in like the early 2000s. I remember reading an article in The Guardian where like a childhood friend called him a Trump supporter. And then there was another one in like AP News that talks about how he is an evangelical pastor and he has talked adamantly against like LGBTQ rights. And he had a list targeted 70 people and they're all Democrats. And I just wanted to clarify that, it was totally ruleless, but all of that is false.
Yeah, and I think like what was it, Don Jr. and it's just so stupid. I mean, like it's just it always just Marxist. Like, that's what they just keep saying. Oh, this is Marxism. This is like Marxists like attacking. I mean, how many people do you think really like, I don't even know that I truly understand the concept of what a Marxist is other than they follow the readings of Karl Marx. But like, uh,
That's
outside of
fine.
that, like, I don't know what that means. Like, I
I
mean,
think,
how many
it's
people really
like a
know what that means?
socialist. Yeah, it's just negative.
Yeah, and it's like it's a convenient, scary sounding word that they never explain, and they don't tell you like there are easier ways to if you really wanted people to understand what a Marxist was. There are words you could use other than Marxist that get at the point faster, like an anti-capitalist. Like these are people who hate capitalism. That's essentially what a Marxist is someone who looks at the world and studies how capitalism has ruined it and wants to correct all that and create a different kind of society that isn't doing all the bad things that capitalism is doing. That's what a Marxist is, and they don't explain that. It takes like 2 seconds to explain, but they don't want to tell you that part.
These Marxists want to nationalize oil.
I'm jumping in, and this is a surprise to everybody, but just was thinking about the Marxist thing, and for me, something that like is a general thing, like first thing that comes to mind is just like the means of production going to the people. It is very anti-capitalist, and it seems like a perfect boogeyman when, for me personally, like the onus of keeping classes separate right now and class warfare and stuff is really like the crux that people have on like the masses. So it makes sense for the boogeyman to be like this Marxist thing, so that if somebody encounters those ideas immediately before even understanding what it is, you're like, oh, Antifa, what? And it just completely takes it off of the table.
Yeah, that explains why they don't explain it, because if people are like anti-capitalist, like, wait a minute, I want to learn more. Like, my life kind of sucks a little bit. Like, I want to learn more about this. Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors.
A shooting occurs. The facts are messy. You feel confused. That's by design.
Learsight Technologies is proud to unveil False Flag Forecast, the nation's first predictive disinformation dashboard, powered by our advanced paranoia graph.
Our algorithm detects how fast Elon, Lee, and 6 Reddit mods can reshape a tragedy into a threat to conservative values, then sends you real-time talking points.
We'll tell you when to post, what to say, and who to blame before the FBI even issues a suspect profile.
With built-in ignore context mode and optional race swap filter, your followers will never wait for nuance again.
Truth is reactive. Narrative is predictive.
False Flag Forecast is intended for speculative outrage only, may cause reputational damage, false arrest, or online radicalization. Consult your algorithm before forming opinions.
By the way, that was our associate producer, Cheyenne, that jumped in. She helps try to keep us on track, which is difficult at times. So thank you. All right, so let's jump on to our last major topic for today. We actually talked about this a little bit in one of our last episodes. It didn't make the cut because we wanted to do a little bit more research into this and look into some of the claims that were being made. But short version is there is a lawsuit moving forward in Rockland County, New York, related to the 2024 election. Specifically, there's a few, I think, districts or voting precincts within that county where the Democratic senator received like a significant amount of votes in one those districts pretty easily. That's Senator Kristen Gilliland from New York, and Kamala Harris got 0 votes in those precincts. And so there's a group that is starting a lawsuit, or has filed a lawsuit. I think it's Smart Elections is the group. And they're basically claiming that there was some sort of fraud. And what they're using as the main underpinning for this legislation or lawsuit is 2 things. There was a U.S. Senate candidate named Diane Dare, and she's part of this lawsuit too. They have sworn affidavits from multiple people that said they voted for this candidate, more than actually showed up in the votes. So they're like, these are pretty small precincts. We're talking like less than 1,000 votes total. And I think for one of them, they've got affidavits from 5 or 6 people that said they voted for this candidate, and only 2 votes or so showed up. Those numbers aren't exactly, I'm just pulling those, but they're roughly accurate. We can get like the actual articles into the notes. But the reason I wanted to talk about this, and we wanted to kind of start talking about this, is because in a lot of the articles that you might see online or a lot of the headlines that you probably see on Reddit, the way that they read, and I'm reading this from the Economic Times of India, I think this is the one here. The way this headline reads is, Kamala Harris won the U.S. elections. Bombshell report claims voting machines were tampered with before 2024. Oh, actually, let me back up a little bit. So there's the Rockland County part, right? And that lawsuit that's going forward. And then there was another report that came out that said that there were changes made to the voting machines in certain areas right before the election in Pennsylvania, Florida, and New Jersey and California, that the company basically says is like, if there are these very minor changes, then they don't have to get that run through by the board that actually reviews all these changes before they go in place. And so there's these two stories that are coming out, right? That there were changes made that weren't reviewed to the actual voting systems, and that Kamala Harris was getting 0 votes in precincts where the Democratic senator won. But the point that I wanted to talk about a little bit is like the article headlines, and what you see on there is basically stating that, you know, Kamala Harris won. This is like total proof of voter fraud. Like everything is, you know, basically very definitive in the way that they're stating this. And what I kind of want to talk about more is like, there's nothing here yet that is 100% proof, right? But the way it's being spread right now is that it's absolutely like, oh, this is true. Like, she won the election. Like, this is like, you know, voter fraud or election interference confirmed. But that's not actually the case that we know of for sure at this moment. So I think it's just important for us to maybe talk about this a little bit, what we know versus what is being said, and like what's next, right? There should be, at least from this lawsuit that's moving forward, there will be discovery. And then I think the New York State Supreme Court ordered a hand recount in these voting districts. So we should get more information out that's more actual proof here. But yeah, just wanted to talk to you guys about that, like what's being said versus what we actually know, and how those kind of narratives are shaping like the conversation online, and could that be dangerous, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I think definitely it's another form of propaganda for sure to have that like reloaded narrative. I don't have too much except for like leading into the conspiracy of it, you know, like I can get into it, but I guess I kind of thought about how like this is kind of like why Republicans do gerrymandering, and like why Trump, you know, wants to oversee the U.S. mail. And, you know, there's definitely like a concerted effort on the Republican Party to not have mail-in voting, or to stop people from voting, and to have certain requirements for voting, like, you know, IDs and all these things, just to like limit the voters, because they know that if they did a paper ballot, mail-in ballot, had a national holiday where everybody voted, I don't believe another Republican would ever be voted in the United States. So it's like all they can do is try to do this stuff. And then for the computerization part of it, it made me think about the Gore v. Bush. I remember watching it with my dad, and there was this guy I looked up, Clint Curtis, who was a computer scientist, you know, former software developer, who testified to the U.S. House Jury Committee, and he said, you can rig the election, you can flip it 51 to 49 to whoever you want. It's undetectable unless you have access to source code or you do a paper audit. He claimed that he produced a prototype in 2000, and he said it was never used, but he highlighted how easily electronic systems could be manipulated. And this is also, you know, echoed by a few other people during the time, but that's like in 2004. Yeah. So definitely
Remember
possible.
the whole hanging Chad controversy in Florida in the 2000 election? Supreme Court, by the way, decided that one for us. So yay, democracy.
Yeah.
But
and it was in Florida, and who's the governor but Turtle Bush? Yeah.
I was just going to bring it back to like the point I made on one of our early episodes is that we need a much, much higher bar for what counts as democracy. Like, we can't just say we're a democracy and then we all believe that that's true. Democracy means at least half of the people approve of the government in power. If you don't have that, you don't have a democracy. And so a healthy democracy wants more and more and more participation in the voting process, not less and less. So we need more transparent processes. We need live streamed, publicly viewed hand recounts of everything. in order to get around this whole computer nonsense. Like, computers are great at making life convenient, but for things that really matter, like making sure that the government in power is one that the people actually want, let's do it the slow, boring way and live stream a hand recount of every district. Like, that be part of the process. You have to count the votes in public where anyone can come and watch. Like, some countries do that, do like a public counting process. And I think that's a healthy thing to get used to. But yeah, to your point too, Arthur, like, accessibility is another thing. People, yay capitalism, are forced to work on voting day. Like, give them the day off work, make it mail-in ballots, try to get as many people involved in the process as possible. Yeah, it's not a legitimate democracy if we're not doing that.
And to your point too, Joe, like the urgency around it, it's like, the election is like midnight, and then it's like by 1 a.m., it's like we have a new president, the other person already seceded. Maybe let's stretch this out. Like, can we get like 6 months to like investigate the entire election? I think like my renewed political standing, I'm not going to be like Democrat or Republican. I'm just pro paper ballot, U.S. mail-in paper ballot. That's my political stance.
I think like the point that you guys are bringing up is really good. Like, so regardless of what happens with this investigation, like, it's good that this is moving forward. It's moving to discovery, right? Like, they're going to do a hand recount. We'll see like what actually occurred here, right? The argument from the county officials is basically that these counties where Kamala Harris received 0 votes are heavily Hasidic locations where everyone kind of votes in a block. And in 2020, there was similar things for Joe Biden. Like, I think where one precinct did vote 100% for Donald Trump, right? So that's the argument being made. Either way, like, this will move forward. We'll get some more facts hopefully out of this. But if this occurred, this would be a overt like election fraud, interference, whatever you want to call it, like stealing an election. But then, just like you were saying, I can't remember if it was Arthur or Joe that said this, but they've been doing things to interfere with the election when it comes to gerrymandering, when it means like you can't hand out water to people in voting lines. Let's remove drop boxes so people have to go to like other locations in order to drop off their ballot. Let's create restrictive voter ID laws that are unnecessary, and because they've already been investigated and voter fraud is actually extremely low. They're already doing things to try and turn the election in their favor, like you're saying. Whether or not they actually took this other step to legitimately change votes or do anything there, it almost, in my mind, like, doesn't matter, because I feel like 100% they would if they could. Like, at least Donald Trump 100% would cheat if he could. Like, I have no doubt in my mind that would take place. Like I said, they've been trying to do that through legal means anyway, right? With all of these restrictions on voting. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, I wonder if this conversation right now and the way that it's presented is like, oh, they definitely cheated. It's like, well, you could almost just say that about everything else that they've done for the last 20 years when it comes to like making voting more difficult. So
I'd love to know too, like I remember in 2004, there was a big stink around who owned the voting machines and who produced them. And it was like ties to like kind of close to the Bush family and the Republican Party. So it's like, maybe we could nationalize voting machines or something. I don't know. There's got to be some solutions here.
Yeah.
What a commie.
I know. I'm going to get swarmed if I say nationalize. Can you imagine if we nationalized our oil though? Like,
please, I'm begging you, do it.
Yeah,
nationalize
the
buses, nationalize the air industry, nationalize the healthcare industry. Don't get me started.
Yeah. The only problem is if they nationalize it now, then it's just nationalize the voting system, and who's got control of that at the moment, right? Well, I mean, they are like, now they are like working on trying to implement some more federal oversight into state elections, and like working on the voting commission and putting people in charge of that are associated with the administration. So like it's continuing, right? Like all of these steps to make it harder for people to actually exercise their democratic rights, right? Like that's what they're doing, and putting their foot on the scale to tip that. A great book on that is Minority Rule. It talks all about how basically since the civil rights movement to now, all the things that have been put in place on the right side, the right wing, to do all of these things, right? From the start of like the Heritage Foundation to the John Birch Society, like all of these different organizations that kind of stood up in response and the legal actions that have been taken. It's a really, really interesting book, and probably one that I'll add to our book club at some point to read, because it pairs well with some of the other ones that we've talked about so far. But if you're interested in learning more about the steps that have already been taken to make it harder for you to exercise your vote, that's a good book to read. So anyway.
Sounds good.
Cool.
We should get a, I don't know, like, you know how we have like Social Security, you can go check your Social Security amount online, or any .gov. There's a lot of .gov profiles that we have. How come we don't have one for like voting, where it's like, here you are, here's your vote. Yes, it's been verified and counted, you know? And
Do
like a
some states
name,
have that?
like I think New York or something, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
In Maryland, I do mail-in voting, and I get an email when they count my ballot. They like send me an email
Wow.
confirming that they've counted it.
That's
Good.
great.
Feels like the bare minimum, but yeah.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow, and the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.